Hello and welcome to Chapter 2, which is all about current good manufacturing practices. We are now living in the world of Subpart B of Part 507, and here are our objectives for the chapter. First and foremost, we're going to describe the purpose of CGMPs and its importance in an animal food safety system. We're going to find where to find information on other programs related to CGMPs, and we're going to explain the basic requirements of CGMP programs. Now, to give you a little bit of background, CGMPs are generally observable practices that establish a baseline of standards for the production of safe animal food. So this is something an inspector could walk into a facility and see that it is happening. So we can see that the equipment is in the right place. We can see that the employees are doing all of the hygiene practices that are outlined in this subpart B. This may be a new set of requirements for facilities. However, from my experience, I've seen that a lot of facilities are already doing most of these things. Now we just have it down in regulation as a requirement. There is a lot of flexibility built into these GMPs, and we're going to see the terms as necessary and as appropriate quite a bit as we go through these. So even though they are a requirement, it's going to be up to the food safety team to establish what exactly these need to look like within the facility that they're working in. So there are some other programs that are already in regulation and already established that kind of relate to this CGMP program. For example, we have employee trainings or hygiene trainings that a lot of facilities already do, such as preventive maintenance, cleaning, sanitation, standard operating procedures. Almost every facility has a set of standard operating procedures that usually incorporate some GMPs into them already. And then, of course, we have things like HACCP, ISO, and PAS 222 that are also considered prerequisite programs that relate to these CGMPs and can probably intertwine with these CGMPs. Here are the different parts of Subpart B that we're going to be going through. I will be reading the actual slides and the text of the regulation quite a bit in this chapter, but I'll also try to provide you with some tangible examples from my experiences. As a side note, the term plant, as in planting grounds in 21 CFR 507.17, is synonymous with the word facility, and both of those terms refer to a place where manufacturing, processing, packing, or holding of animal food occurs. I should also tell you up front that this section, this subpart, does not require documentation. Okay, so records are not required to be produced through this subpart. However, they may be helpful as we're going to see in the future. So here's the first section, 507.14, and this talks about the personnel or the people involved in carrying out your food safety system. And I think a really important thing to communicate when it comes to your personnel is that we are trying to make a shift in the mindset of the people that produce animal food. Taking some ownership and understanding the importance of their job is critical to making sure that we are producing safe animal food. So every single person that manufactures, processes, packs, or holds animal food has to be responsible for maintaining these GMPs and maintaining a safe environment for their animal food. So let's take a look at what this regulation says. The management of the establishment must take reasonable measures and precautions to ensure that all persons working in direct contact with animal food contact surfaces, and animal food packaging materials conform to hygienic practices to the extent necessary to protect against the contamination of animal food. So remember, we're in subpart B. That means the management of an establishment is responsible for ensuring that this happens. We've also talked a little bit about hygienic practices already in this curriculum, and Part B gives us kind of a breakdown list of what we mean when we say hygienic practices. Maintaining adequate personal cleanliness, washing hands thoroughly in an adequate hand washing facility as necessary and appropriate to protect against contamination, removing or securing jewelry and other objects that might fall into animal food equipment or containers, storing clothing or other personal belongings in areas other than where animal food is exposed, taking any other necessary precautions to protect against the contamination of animal food contact surfaces, or animal food packaging materials. And remember that the AFIA does have a video available that goes through all 5 of those different practices that you can use in your employee hygiene training. So here are some tangible examples here. So a facility can provide lockers to store personal effects. They need to provide hand washing facilities as appropriate. So it is appropriate in some cases that a waterless hand cleaner could be used. So some sort of like alcohol-based sanitizer is considered adequate or appropriate in certain situations. It's probably also a good idea to post signage within your hand washing facilities to reinforce or reiterate the importance of that hygiene practice for the production of safe animal food. Other signs such as your jewelry policy or your personal effects policy could be posted around the facility as well. You'll notice that piece of regulation didn't say that jewelry cannot be worn during the production of animal food. It is as adequate, as appropriate, as necessary to the work environment. I've spoken with a number of facilities where all of the employees carry a box knife on their person so that they can be opening bags as they're mixing ingredients and so on and so forth. So I've had many conversations about how to make sure that their employees have access and use of the tools necessary for the job, while not increasing the likelihood of those tools falling into some sort of ingredient bin or getting mixed in with the product. And so some of the ideas we've come up with is having the tools on a lanyard that can be clipped to the person's clothing and then just used as necessary, so there's never any risk of that being dropped into the ingredient bin. That was a good solution for that. I've also heard facilities just requiring that there's no low-hanging jewelry or low-hanging necklaces allowed, but things like earrings could be allowed. So anyways, just kind of going with your facility history and deciding what kind of risk level you want to take as a food safety team is important for making these personnel policy decisions. Develop a personnel cleanliness protocol with training that specifies expectations regarding hand washing, wearing of jewelry, carrying of cell phones and tools. All of that stuff will be important to establish and train your employees on. Plants and grounds. So again, a plant refers to a facility. So the grounds around an animal food plant under the control of the management of the establishment must be kept in a condition that will protect against the contamination of animal food. Maintenance of grounds must include properly storing equipment, removing litter and waste, and cutting weeds or grass within the immediate vicinity of the plant that may constitute an attractant, breeding place, or harborage for pests. Maintaining driveways, yards, and parking areas so that they do not constitute a source of contamination in areas where animal food is exposed, adequately draining areas that may contribute to contamination of animal food, and treating and disposing of waste so that it does not constitute a source of contamination in areas where animal food is exposed. So this section is not only addressing the outsides of the facility, as in cutting weeds and grass within the immediate vicinity, but also within the facility, making sure that you're treating and disposing of waste and adequately draining all of the areas where the potential for animal food contamination could occur. If a facility is on land that is leased and not owned, this land is still considered under the control of the management and needs to be maintained per this regulation. This section applies to any of the grounds that could impact plant operations. The plant must be suitable in size, construction, and design to facilitate cleaning, maintenance, and pest control to reduce the potential for contamination of animal food contact surfaces, and animal food packaging materials, including that the plant must provide adequate space between equipment walls and stored materials to permit employees to perform their duties and to allow cleaning and maintenance of equipment, be constructed in a manner such that drip and condensate from fixtures, ducts, and pipes does not serve as a source of contamination, provide adequate ventilation where necessary and appropriate to minimize vapors and fumes in areas where they may contaminate animal food and in a manner that minimizes the potential for contaminating animal food. Provide adequate lighting in hand washing areas, toilet rooms, areas where animal food is received, manufactured, processed, packed, or held, and areas where equipment or utensils are cleaned. And provide shatter-resistant light bulbs, fixtures, and skylights or other glass items suspended over exposed animal food in any step of preparation to protect against the contamination of animal food in case of glass breakage. Now that seems like a lot, right? But this regulation is not intended for you to completely renovate your facility. I know here in Oregon, where I'm located, there's a lot of feed facilities, a lot of feed mills that were built in the early 1900s or even the late 1800s that aren't necessarily modern and may not meet all of these requirements. However, the intention is not for you to completely tear down your facility and start over. We don't want to make facilities go bankrupt. But this is intended to make sure that you do think about what renovations could be necessary for meeting this definition of as adequate, right? So all of these say as adequate, as necessary, and as appropriate. So the intention here is just for you to think through the design and layout of your facility and make sure that it contributes to the production of safe animal food as opposed to introducing more hazards or increasing the likelihood of hazards. We do have a definition for adequate within the rule. It is defined as that which is needed to accomplish the intended purpose in keeping with good public health practice. Okay, great. However, adequacy can be influenced by the facility layout, the type of facility, the type of manufacturing practices happening, and then also the intended species. So what animal species is our intended species here, and what kind of facilities are going to be adequate for preventing hazards in that species. So like I said, existing facilities likely don't need to be redesigned or reconstructed, but it will be important to think through those requirements and make sure that the facility is in compliance with them. One specific thing that is pointed out in the regulation is the idea of shatterproof or shatter-resistant glass above storage and production areas. That definitely will be a critical thing that we need to make sure all of our facilities are protecting from glass contamination by replacing those fixtures. So that could be a pretty simple and low-cost way of retrofitting your facility to meet these requirements. We also have a section of the Plant and Grounds GMPs that addresses the storage of bulk material outdoors. And again, I want to stress here that this is only as necessary and as appropriate. So using a protective covering might be a solution that you want to use if you're storing outdoors in bulk. Controlling areas over and around the bulk animal food to eliminate harborage of pests, and checking on a regular basis for pests will be important as well. So if you're in an animal food facility that does store ingredients outdoors, you're probably familiar with all of the pests and pest infestation that could come along with that practice. And again, in the end, as long as we're producing safe animal food and doing everything within our power to prevent contamination, then that is going to be as necessary and as appropriate. So here's a good picture here of an outdoor storage facility. This facility has decided to use a protective cover, and there's also walls along this pile of ingredients that could help prevent pest infestation here. So all of those things are up to that facility. That's what they've decided is necessary or appropriate to protect their feed. There is some additional language in the preamble that addresses this regulation specifically about storage outdoors, bulk storage outdoors. So if your facility engages in this practice, I'd recommend reading up on those sections of the preamble to see some more context and some more best practices. Part 507.19 is all about sanitation GMPs. So building structures, fixtures, and other physical facilities of the plant must be kept clean and in good repair to prevent animal food from becoming adulterated. Great, that's kind of the point of all of these practices and all of these GMPs, right? Animal food contact and non-contact surfaces of utensils and equipment must be cleaned and maintained, and utensils and equipment stored as necessary to protect against the contamination of animal food contact surfaces, or animal food packaging materials. When necessary, equipment must be disassembled for thorough cleaning. In addition, when animal food contact surfaces used for manufacturing, process, packing, or holding animal food are wet cleaned, the surfaces must, when necessary, be thoroughly dried before subsequent use, and in wet processing of animal food, when cleaning and sanitizing is necessary to protect against the introduction of undesirable microorganisms into animal food, all animal food contact surfaces must be cleaned and sanitized before use and after any interruption during which the animal food contact surfaces may have become contaminated. Okay, I think all of that makes a lot of sense, right? If we are using utensils and equipment, we should be cleaning them regularly. We need to protect the animal food from contamination via our equipment and utensils, and we need to be specifically diligent when we are using wet cleaning or wet processing of our animal feed. So minimizing the potential sources of environmental contamination by adequate cleaning and, when necessary, sanitizing procedures. This does not say you have to sanitize every animal food contact surface every single day, but it does say, as necessary, you should probably be considering sanitizing procedures. Now, I want to stress that this idea of cleaning and sanitation is going to be very different depending on the different industries we're talking about. So within the animal food world, we have two very different categories of pet food versus livestock food, right? So these pictures right here are meant to emphasize the difference between cleaning types. So right here we have pictures of a hammer mill. And on the left-hand side, we can see that hammer mill is much dirtier than the one on the right-hand side, right? Like there's a lot of dust accumulation on that hammer mill. However, if we think about in reality, in a feed mill, that amount of dust could be just a single day's accumulation. And that might be clean enough to be adequate for that facility. So as long as there's not like rodent feces or oil dripping out of those pieces of machinery, that is adequately cleaned for its purposes. Now, if we look at the picture on the right-hand side, that makes me think that this is either a brand new piece of equipment that hasn't been used yet, or we're dealing with a facility that has a microorganism concerned where this piece of machinery is thoroughly cleaned and sanitized using a wet cleaning process to get it spick and span like it is. Okay, so just keep in mind the intended species and the manufacturing practices within that facility dictate what is necessary or adequate in all of these. Our sanitation section also addresses cleaning compounds and other like toxic materials that may be present in a facility. First and foremost, cleaning compounds need to be safe and adequate. If we think about making sure we don't mess up the chemistry of any of the animal food we're dealing with by using a cleaning compound that could do something like that, that will be important. Also, for using a sanitizing agent that should be removed after it is sanitized, maybe just wiped off or using water to wipe it off, then we need to make sure we have procedures in place to make sure that's being done. This regulation does say that we can have toxic materials within the facility. For example, things that are used to clean or sanitize, things used in laboratory procedures, plant and equipment maintenance, or necessary for plant operations. Can be allowed within the facility. Things like rodenticide or pesticide could also be used if that's necessary for preventing hazards. However, all of those toxic materials need to be A, stored correctly, and B, used correctly. So making sure we have those procedures and trainings in place, and also making sure we have a separate, well-identified area to store those toxic materials is important for meeting this piece of regulation. So here's an example of a toxic material that is not stored correctly. This is intended to be a non-food grade petroleum-based lubricant that is sitting over a micro-ingredient bin. Okay, so the point here is that having this non-food grade lubricant is not the problem. Those are allowed to be within the facility because they're necessary for plant operations. But storing it right here violates this regulation. It needs to be stored correctly in a separate section away from the exposed animal food. Okay, so some examples of toxic materials that could be allowed will be things like fertilizers, cleaning compounds, treated seeds, and pesticides. Toxic materials must be stored separately from materials intended for animal food and where animal food is manufactured, processed, packed, or stored. Couple more points on the sanitation. Effective measures must be taken to exclude pests from the manufacturing process, packing, or holding areas, and to protect against the contamination of animal food by pests. The use of pesticides in the plant is permitted only under precautions and restrictions that will protect against the contamination of animal food contact surfaces, and animal food packaging materials. Trash must be conveyed, stored, and disposed of in a way that protects against the contamination of animal food contact surfaces, animal food packaging materials, water supplies, and ground surfaces, and minimizes the potential for the trash to become an attractant or harborage or breeding place for pests. Okay, I think that makes a lot of sense and ties into all of this general idea of cleanliness and sanitation within the facility. Now let's talk about water supply and plumbing. So this is 507.20. Water must be adequate for the operations and must be derived from an adequate source. Notice that doesn't say potable, right? Just adequate. Running water at a suitable temperature and under suitable pressure as needed must be provided in all areas. Again, deciding what is suitable is up to the facility and the food safety team. Water that contacts animal food contact surfaces, or animal food packaging material must be safe for its intended use. And water may be reused for washing, rinsing, or conveying animal food if it does not increase the level of contamination of the animal food. So again, I think this is a section where the animal food safety team within the facility is going to have to make all these decisions about what is safe, what is adequate, and making sure that your water supply and plumbing meets those definitions. So adequate for operation from an adequate source, sufficient temperature and pressure is necessary. Safe for intended use, should be free of contaminants that could adulterate the animal food, and you can reuse the water if you use it in a safe manner. Again, does not have to be potable, just adequate. And I think a lot of times we see, especially in livestock facilities, that non-potable water is still safe for the production of that feed. I've also seen a lot of facilities that use municipal reports or well certifications to kind of justify their decisions on whether their water source is safe or adequate. And I think that's, in general, a good business practice to have some sort of documentation to help you make those decisions. So let's talk a little bit about plumbing too. So we kind of talked about water supply. Now we can talk about the plumbing as well. The plumbing must be designed, installed, and maintained to carry adequate quantities of water, properly convey sewage, avoid being a source of contamination, provide adequate floor drainage, and ensure that there is no backflow from or cross-connection between piping systems that discharge wastewater or sewage and piping systems that carry water for animal food or animal food manufacturing. So just making sure there's not an introduction of hazards in the plumbing system as well. Now, if an inspector comes to your facility and wants to observe your GMPs, they're probably not going to look at each and every single pipe going through your facility, but if there's something obvious that is creating a hazard or introducing a hazard or increasing the likelihood of a hazard and it relates to your plumbing, they're going to be able to see that. And now within this regulation, it's mandated that you're making sure that doesn't happen. And especially if you do create adulterated food, you have to do a recall, something like that, and it comes back to a plumbing problem, here's the regulation that can be pointed to that says you should have had this taken care of. Sewage and liquid disposal waste must be disposed of through an adequate system or other adequate means. Each plant must provide employees with adequate, readily accessible toilet facilities. Toilet facilities must be kept clean and must not be a potential source of contamination of animal food contact surfaces, or animal food packaging materials. Now, I've had a couple of people come through my classes that kind of panic at that bullet point right there, to such an extreme case as one facility was manufacturing animal food and their quote-unquote toilet facilities were in a convenience store across the street from the food manufacturing facility. And that's fine. That still is readily accessible. And as long as that toilet is accessible during all hours of production, that can be an adequate toilet facilities. But within this regulation, now the animal food facility is responsible for making sure those toilet facilities are kept clean and not a potential source of contamination. So I think the solution this facility came up with was to draw up a contract between themselves and the convenience store to make sure that facility was kept clean. So there are ways to work around this if you do not have toilet facilities within your building, but just keep in mind that it is the responsibility of the food manufacturer to make sure that they're clean and well maintained and don't provide a source of potential contamination. Okay. Also with hand washing facilities, each plant must provide hand washing facilities designed to ensure that an employee's hands are not a potential source of contamination of animal food contact surfaces, or animal food packaging materials. Again, that can be as simple as a waterless hand washing facility as well. So a couple of extra notes here. If your food safety team determines that a specific temperature or pressure is required for sanitation or proper sanitation, those things should probably be measured so you can make sure you're actually meeting that requirement. FDA does have an employee health and personal hygiene handbook available that could help guide deciding what some of those parameters should be. That document is designed for the human food side of things, but it can definitely be used within the animal food world, and particularly when we're talking about pet food, dog and cat food, or any pet food, and we're specifically worried about microorganisms. That might be a good resource for determining those parameters. Adequate restroom facilities are required, and sewage wastewater must be conveyed so as not to cause animal food adulteration. And additional hand washing facilities may be necessary depending on the operation. So you might already have hand washing facilities available, but do you need to consider putting more of them in to make sure that you that your employees are definitely following your procedures and guidelines. Just some things to consider as we're talking about water supply and plumbing. 507.22 is all about the equipment and the utensils used in the animal food manufacturing process. All plant equipment and utensils, including equipment and utensils that do not come in contact with animal food, must be designed and constructed of such material and workmanship to be adequately cleanable and must be properly maintained. Equipment and utensils must be designed, constructed, and used appropriately to avoid the adulteration of animal food with non-food grade lubricants, fuel, metal fragments, contaminated water, or any other contaminants. And equipment must be installed so as to facilitate the cleaning and maintenance of the equipment and adjacent spaces. So think about the equipment and utensils used in your facility and ask yourself, are they constructed of a material that is appropriate and safe for their purposes? And can they be cleaned easily? So are you dealing with a piece of equipment that has 23 different parts that has to be cleaned every day? That may not be a feasible choice for your equipment or for your manufacturing process. Maybe it is. Maybe you have the resources and time to be able to thoroughly clean that every day, but some facilities are not. So just thinking about when you're choosing your equipment, making sure it's designed appropriately for its use and also for cleaning. Specifically, animal food contact surfaces are something we need to pay extra special attention to. They need to be made of materials that withstand the environment of their use and the action of animal food, and if applicable, the action of cleaning compounds, cleaning procedures, and sanitizing agents. So making sure that surface is not going to break down and go into the animal food over time. It needs to be made of non-toxic materials and maintained to protect animal food from being contaminated. Holding, conveying, manufacturing, and processing systems, including gravimetric, pneumatic, closed, and automated systems, must be designed, constructed, and maintained in a way to protect against the animal food. I would also add the phrase used in a way to protect against the contamination of animal food, and I'll talk about that in just another second. Each freezer and cold storage compartment used to hold animal food must be fitted with an accurate temperature monitoring device. So that's kind of a unique statement for this GMP section. We haven't seen many specific things required, especially when it comes to our equipment. But because freezers and cold storage are so critical for minimizing the growth of microorganisms and the production of toxins, the rule specifically included this to make sure that they are actually being monitored to stay at that temperature. So if you have a freezer, make sure you've got a thermometer on it. Okay, so here's a good picture here of some utensils that are being nicely stored. They look pretty clean from here and are stored up off of the ground and away from any animal food. So equipment, storage, conveyors, and utensils such as brooms, shovels, scoops must be in good physical condition so they are not a source of contamination themselves. Select equipment and utensils made of materials that will withstand the condition of use in the facility. So these utensils here look like they're probably made of rubber and plastic or hard plastic, so that looks like it could be just fine for this facility. A little bit more on equipment and utensils here. So instruments and controls used for measuring, regulating, or recording temperatures, pH, AW means water activity or other conditions that control or prevent the growth of undesirable microorganisms in animal food must be accurate, precise, adequately maintained, and adequate in number for their designated uses. So this again is a very specific statement about if you're going to use these tools to help control your hazards, they need to be accurate, they need to be precise, and they need to be adequately maintained and adequate in number to make sure you are actually controlling that hazard. Compressed air and other gases mechanically introduced into animal food or used to clean animal food contact surfaces or equipment must be used in such a way to protect against the contamination of animal food. I had one gentleman share a story with me of a facility that was trying to control the hazard of aflatoxin in their corn products. And one of the only things that you can do to help monitor or control aflatoxin in a manufacturing facility is to test it as it comes into the facility. And in this particular facility, the incoming ingredient bay or drop area was directly next to the air compressor that was used to dry clean the rest of the facility. And so as the corn was being dropped off at the facility, all of the corn dust, which is where the aflatoxin lives, was being sucked into the air compressor and then blown all over the rest of the facility. So that's a very simple design situation that could have easily prevented contamination of a lot of animal food. So thinking about how you're using your compressed air, should you have a filter, where is your compressed air placed, and is it exposing the rest of your facility to contaminants? All those things should be considered. Okay, so temperature of freezers and cold storage or other instruments to maintain specific environmental conditions associated with preventing animal food hazards must be effective, precise. Compressed air should be used cautiously when cleaning so as to protect against the contamination of animal food. If you're dealing with microorganisms, maybe you should consider having a filter on your compressed air system, or maybe you should have a protocol to make sure you're not blowing aflatoxin into non-contaminated parts of the facility. Okay, 507.25 is all about plant operations. So what manufacturing, processing, or packing are you doing within the facility that could introduce hazards or increase the likelihood of hazards? And what kind of things do we need to do to make sure they don't do that? So first of all, management of the establishment must ensure that all operations in the manufacturing, processing, packing, and holding of animal food, including operations directed to receiving, inspecting, transporting, and segregating, are conducted in accordance with the current good manufacturing practice requirements of this subpart. Okay, that's kind of the general blanket statement, making sure that all of this meets all of the rest of the requirements of this subpart. Animal food, including raw materials, other ingredients, or rework, must be accurately identified. Please make sure you have everything labeled. Animal food packaging materials are safe and suitable. The overall cleanliness of the plant is under the supervision of one or more competent individuals assigned responsibility for this function. Adequate precautions are taken so that plant operations do not contribute to the contamination of animal food. Chemical, microbial, or extraneous material testing procedures are used where necessary to identify sanitation failures. Animal food that has become adulterated is rejected, disposed of, or if appropriate, treated or processed to eliminate the adulteration. And please make sure you have it labeled throughout that process. All animal food manufacturing, processing, packing, or holding is conducted under such conditions and controls as are necessary to minimize the potential for the growth of undesirable microorganisms and protect against the contamination of animal food. Raw materials and other ingredients must be examined to ensure that they are suitable for manufacturing and processing into animal food and must be handled under conditions that will protect against contamination and minimize deterioration. Okay, this is specifically true when we have incoming ingredients. We need to make sure that we are at least visually inspecting them to make sure they're suitable for manufacturing and processing. So shipping containers and bulk vehicles holding raw materials and other ingredients must be examined upon receipt. So that's another mandate within the regulation here, something you absolutely have to do. Raw materials must be cleaned as necessary to minimize contamination, and raw materials or other ingredients must be stored in containers designed and constructed in a way that protects against contamination. Okay, so making sure you're using appropriate materials for those containers. Maybe you should consider having lids on your containers. All of that stuff needs to be considered with the intention of protecting against contamination and deterioration. Susceptible to contamination with mycotoxins or other natural toxins must be evaluated and used in a manner that does not result in animal food that can cause illness or injury to animals or humans. And if frozen, must be kept frozen. If thawing is required prior to use, it must be done in a manner that minimizes the potential for growth of undesirable microorganisms. A couple of points from the preamble when it comes to inbound raw ingredients. Weather can be considered when evaluating raw materials that are susceptible to mycotoxin contamination. So yes, we should inspect them. Yes, we should make a decision of whether they are adequate for use or appropriate for use, but we can also consider the region that those raw ingredients came from and what kind of weather patterns have been happening that might increase or reduce the likelihood of mycotoxin contamination. Not every load of grain needs to be tested as long as evaluation results in the facility using ingredients in a manner that does not result in harm to humans or animals. Okay, so again, that's kind of a business decision of how often you want to make sure you're doing testing or evaluation as long as it's adequate and appropriate. Visual examination of ingredients or shipping containers is acceptable, with emphasis on observing any unusual residues that may contaminate the animal food. And sometimes I think that's going to be our only way to inspect or examine inbound ingredients. Is just going to be a visual examination of the product and also the shipping containers. For the purposes of manufacturing, process, packing, or holding, the following apply. Animal food must be maintained under conditions that will minimize the potential for growth of undesirable microorganisms and prevent the animal food from becoming adulterated during manufacturing, processing, packing, and holding. So just a little bit more emphasis there on trying to control microorganisms and trying to prevent adulteration. Measures taken during manufacturing, processing, packing, or holding of animal food to significantly minimize or prevent the growth of undesirable microorganisms must be adequate to prevent adulteration of animal food. Work in progress and rework must be handled in such a way that is protected against contamination of the growth of undesirable microorganisms. Again, an emphasis there on the microorganisms. And steps such as cutting, drying, defatting, grinding, mixing, extruding, pelleting, and cooling must be performed in a way that protects against the contamination of animal food. So those are all kind of manufacturing and processing steps. Filling, assembling, packaging, and other operations must be performed in such a way that protects against the contamination of animal food and the growth of undesirable microorganisms. Animal food that relies principally on the control of water activity for preventing the growth of undesirable microorganisms must be processed to and maintained at a safe water activity level. So if you're not familiar with water activity, that essentially refers to the amount of moisture in a specific ingredient or a specific mixture. And the idea behind controlling it is that microorganisms need a certain level of moisture in order to grow and thrive and reproduce. So if we're dealing with dry ingredients and we can keep that water activity level down below the level needed for microorganisms, then that's a good method of controlling them. And sometimes our only method of controlling them. Animal food that relies principally on the control of pH for preventing the growth of undesirable microorganisms must be monitored and maintained at the appropriate pH. And when ice is used in contact with animal food, it must be made from water that is safe and must be used only if it has been manufactured in accordance with current good manufacturing practice as outlined in this subpart. So where appropriate, conduct appropriate evaluations to ensure inbound materials are safe. Raw materials must be evaluated for suitability and shipping containers inspected to verify adulteration has not occurred. Hold materials in a safe manner. Flushes, rework, and rejected feed must be identified and utilized or disposed of appropriately. Work in progress and rework must be protected against contamination and growth of biological hazards, and manufacture in a way to ensure safety. For example, reliance on water activity or pH to prevent growth of biological hazards must be monitored. So now let's talk about holding and distribution. Animal food held for distribution must be held under conditions that will protect against contamination and minimize deterioration, including some of the following. Containers used to hold animal food before distribution must be designed, constructed of appropriate material, cleaned as necessary, and maintained to protect against the contamination of animal food. And animal food held for distribution must be held in a way that protects against contamination from sources such as trash. Okay, I think that's pretty standard practice. That makes a lot of sense. Labeling for the animal food ready for distribution must contain, when applicable, information and instructions for safely using the animal food for the intended animal species. So that's going to look a little bit different depending on the facility, but there is, written down there a requirement that it needs to be labeled for appropriate instructions for safe feeding of the product, particularly when it comes to intended species. Shipping containers and bulk vehicles used to distribute animal food must be examined prior to use to protect against the contamination of animal food from the container or vehicle when the facility is responsible for transporting the animal food itself, or if it arranges with a third party to transport the animal food. So you might be relying on your transportation company to make sure their trucks are clean. However, this says you also need to examine it before you load any product into that truck. Animal food returned from distribution must be assessed for animal food safety to determine the appropriate disposition. Returned animal food must be identified as such and segregated until assessed. Unpackaged or bulk animal food must be held in a manner that does not result in unsafe cross-contamination with other animal food. There are some additional responsibilities for facilities that load or transport animal food in the sanitary transport rule of FSMA, and those kind of overlap with this holding and distribution section. We have a specific holding and distribution section for animal food, for human food byproducts that are used as animal food. Now, earlier when we talked about the exceptions for human food byproducts, I said that you had to be in compliance with Part 117, which is the human food rule, and also be in compliance with Part 507.28, which is this right here. This is the holding and distribution section. So let's take a look at what this says right here. Human food byproducts held for distribution as animal food must be held under conditions that will protect against contamination, including the following. Containers and equipment used to convey or hold human food byproducts for use as animal food before distribution must be designed, constructed of appropriate material, cleaned as necessary, and maintained to protect against the contamination of human food byproducts for use as animal food. Human food byproducts for use as animal food held for distribution must be held in a way to protect against contamination from sources such as trash, and during holding, human food byproducts for use as animal food must be accurately identified. So that sounds really similar to our holding and distribution for just animal food. But this piece does include the fact that during holding, the human food byproducts for use as animal food must be accurately identified. And this may be a new requirement for human food facilities. So this is specifically saying that if you have a byproduct for use as animal food, it needs to say animal food on it, so it doesn't get mixed up with your other human food products or used in a way that could adulterate your human food products. So Part 507.25 is the section that covers the identification of animal food, but because these human food byproducts are not going to be subject to that, we addressed it in this section as well. Keep in mind though, these labeling or these identification, the methods of doing that is flexible and it should be worked into what's already happening in the facility. Labeling that identifies the product by common or usual name must be affixed to or accompany the human food byproducts for use as animal food when distributed. Again, that can be flexible as long as it's associated with it in some manner, but it does have to be there. Shipping containers and bulk vehicles used to distribute human food byproducts for use as animal food must be examined prior to use to protect against the contamination of animal food from the container or vehicle when the facility is responsible for transporting the human food byproducts for use as animal food itself, or when it arranges with a third party to do the transportation. Again, that sounds a lot like our regular animal food distribution and holding regulation. So here's a couple examples of what holding and distribution could look like. For holding and distribution of ingredients, human food byproducts for use in animal food, or animal food itself, it's required that containers are appropriate to protect against contamination. So I think we have two good examples here of some containers that are enclosed and not allowing the ingredients or product to be exposed to the outside environment where they could pick up a contaminant. We are also supposed to use containers in bulk vehicles that are examined prior to use. So again, I have a couple examples here. So the picture on the left-hand side is a picture of the inside of a truck. And so this could be an example of someone just poking their head in there and visually inspecting. Now, that particular truck there is not completely clean, right? There's still some residue in there. But remember that the regulation says to look for unusual residue or residue that you think could introduce a hazard. So, thinking about whether this truck was hauling horse feed or is going to haul horse feed, and maybe they had like cattle feed in it before, that could potentially introduce some hazards that you need to be aware of and informed about. And you'll notice on the right-hand side that those two workers both have their eyes in places where they can inspect the truck and the unloading of those ingredients. The man on the right is watching the ingredients and doing a visual inspection as they go into the holding bin. So to summarize all of Chapter 2 there, CGMP regulations provide the foundation necessary for production of safe animal food. These are things that can be observed and set the baseline of standard practices for safe production of animal feed. CGMP regulations are required and most are managed outside of the Food Safety Plan, which is what comes up in Subpart C. It's important to understand the specific requirements and train as necessary in order that all individuals involved understand and effectively implement CGMP regulations. And as I mentioned before, while these do not require documentation, nowhere in this chapter did I say you had to write down that your employees were washing their hands or write down that the equipment was evaluated to make sure that it was properly spaced. Some documentation like that may be helpful to help justify some of your hazard control decisions later on and in Subpart C in your food safety plan. So while documentation is not required, in my experiences, a lot of companies choose to document a lot of these because they support their decisions and because they support the food safety system and the effectiveness of their food safety system. And that wraps up Chapter 2 on CGMPs.